Greetings, brethren, CloakingDonkey here, and I will admit, because of time constraints, I don't watch that much YouTube these days anymore, so when I do have the time, I usually watch things that really interest me, such as politics and history. But sometimes I do still venture into those gaming spheres and check out what other people are making. And one trend that has kind of caught my eye in the last month or two in the MMORPG genre of videos on YouTube is people making videos with titles such as, "Are MMOs dead? What is the future going to be like?" And now obviously part of that is really just clickbait. And to be fair, there's nothing wrong with the clickbait, that's just how YouTube works these days. If you want to get your video noticed, if you want people to click on it when they randomly are presented with it on their front page or in the sidebar, then your video has to have a catchy title and a nice image. That's just how it goes. But I don't think just playing it off as clickbait isn't exactly correct, because I do think there is a legitimate fear in people that this is the case, that MMOs really are dying, hence why the clickbait is so effective. And spoiler alert, pretty much all the videos that pose this question end in the exact same way. No, MMOs aren't dead, they're just taking a break, or they're just changing, or they're just taking a new form, becoming more indie, blah blah blah, one of these. But the reason I'm going to talk about this issue is because I think there is a core that a lot of people are really missing when it comes to this topic. It's because we haven't been seeing any of the big blockbuster, quote-unquote, wow killer MMOs anymore. You know, things like Star Wars The Old Republic, WildStar, Guild Wars 2, things like that just aren't really on the horizon anymore. If you look at the current spectrum of what's going to come is, well, it's really just MMORPGs from Korea, expansions for games that are already out, strange games that exist somewhere on the fringe of MMORPGs but aren't like your regular MMORPGs, things like the New World game that's being made by the Amazon game development studio. And apart from that, just the crowdfunded projects that I also have been talking about. So Camelot Unchained, Crowfall, Pantheon Rise of the Fallen, Shroud of the Avatar, Chronicles of Illyria, and Ashes of Referral. Now, when I look at this list of crowdfunded MMORPGs, I get really excited, because to me, they are what I'm looking for, the kind of game that I would be interested in. But I also think there are people who look at this and think, what is all of this indie trash? Where is my next WildStar that I can play for a month and then say it's bad? You see, I think a lot of people are still stuck in a place where they think of MMORPGs to be basically what World of Warcraft is. But at the same time, these will be the people who get really upset when I call pretty much everything that has come out in the last 12 years WoW clones. This is also partly the fault of various memes. This whole idea that WoW was the first MMO, I think there is actually a kernel of truth to that, and that is that WoW isn't really an MMORPG by the definition of what MMORPGs were before World of Warcraft came out. World of Warcraft is very much a special case, and you will get many people who will tell you that World of Warcraft really just took a whole bunch of things from EverQuest and Ultima Online and turned it into a better game. But that really isn't the case. If you really think about it, what are the core things that make up World of Warcraft? I mean, the most prominent thing that everybody was talking about, even when it came out, was its questing system. The ability to play the game by yourself from level 1 to max level with the questing system that just led you through the game basically, and you always had little jobs to do, and there was a bit of story contained within the zones that was told through the quest system. Then beyond that, I would say that instance dungeons are a big thing that define World of Warcraft, and so are instanced raids and instanced battlegrounds, as well as the very much spirally item gear level system, and the specific usage of the green, blue, purple rarity system. I really think that these 5 things are what make up the core of World of Warcraft. Sure, you have your factions, but they don't really play that much of an effect outside of PvP. And even in PvP, they don't really matter that much beyond what races people are going to be on both sides. The PvP system could just as well be a blue mercenary and a red mercenary team with people from both factions thrown into it. The factions are meaningless, so let's go back to these 5 systems. The questing system, instance dungeons, instance raids, instance battlegrounds, and the item spiral / gear color system. None of these 5 core systems were actually taken from EverQuest. Not a single one of them. Quests. Despite the name, EverQuest didn't actually have a questing system. Sure, there were quests in the game, and they were great, and they gave you experience, and some of them were epic and really long-winded, but they weren't designed to carry you through the leveling experience. The leveling was very much based on just killing things to gain experience, and quests would be thrown in every now and then, just like it was in Dark Age of Camelot and in Ultima Online. The only game that ever built in any way on this idea of story and continuous quests and stuff like that was Asheron's Call, but even that game did not have a fully fledged questing system. Next, instance dungeons. That was not a thing before World of Warcraft. Now, EverQuest and Dark Age of Camelot, etc., they all had their dungeons, but they were never instanced. They were not scripted. You would go in there would be mobs patrolling through the dungeon, there would be bosses even, but everything would respawn after a pretty reasonable amount of time, just like it did in the outside world. And as many groups as could fit in there could go in at the same time. There was no instancing whatsoever, it was just a separate zone. So you went into the dungeon and you were ported to a separate zone, but everyone got ported to that same version of that separate zone. And the same goes for instanced raids. Anyone who's actually played EverQuest will remember that the community had to sit together to figure out who gets to kill the boss when it respawns and who gets to clear the raids when it respawns. The raids and bosses usually had a few hours to a day of respawn timers, sometimes maybe even a week. I don't quite remember exactly how long the spawn timers were, but there were spawn timers and they would be for the entire server. So the servers had to actually work together to figure out who gets to go in there. And there was a lot of competition and there was a lot of drama over it and all of that. There was no instancing. Instancing, for the most part, yes, there were some other cases of instancing before that, but in the way it was used for dungeons and raids and battlegrounds, it was absolutely pioneered by World of Warcraft. Next, we have the instanced battlegrounds. They did not exist in MMORPGs before that. Dark Age of Camelot and Ultima Online were the two big PvP MMORPGs before World of Warcraft came out. And Ultima Online was entirely open world. I don't think they even had anything like a battleground. And Dark Age of Camelot did have battlegrounds, however, those battlegrounds were really just smaller PvP areas limited to a certain level range. So for example, the first big one that everybody went to was Thidranki at level 20 to 24. So any character that was between level 20 and 24 could go there, but it was still just one area for every character level 20 to 24. There was no artificial balancing of the sides. Players had to figure all that out themselves. There could be raids. There could be hundreds of people from one realm in there at the same time. It was just a regular outdoor zone. It was just separate from the game world. In the same way that the Eastern Kingdoms are separate from Kalimdor, but are still both open world zones. So that's 4 of the 5 systems out of the way. And so that just leaves the items. And with the items it's a little bit muddier because EverQuest did have item qualities, it did have item level upgrades. But even in that regard, EverQuest was nowhere near as focused on that as World of Warcraft was. And the gear specifically in EverQuest really was not balanced around the idea of having all this best in slot stuff. There were quite harsh differences in the level of balancing that went into these items. The idea of this balanced gear increase for all the classes, to have them all progress at the same power level through their gear sets, and having these strict separations into green and blue and purple gear, that really only came in with World of Warcraft. Dark Age of Camelot, for example, doesn't even have item qualities. There, all items are just magical, and they are bound to a specific level range, and colors mean something completely different in that game. So what am I really trying to say with this? What I'm trying to say is that World of Warcraft, at its core, was really not an MMORPG in the veins of EverQuest and Ultima Online and all the other MMORPGs that came before it. It was much more an MMO version of what Blizzard had already done with Diablo 2. Because if you really think about it, the questing system kind of is a continuation from the quests in Diablo 2. Now, while those quests obviously didn't get you to max level in Diablo 2, they absolutely guided you through each of the acts. Each of the acts had 6 quests, and by the time you completed all of these quests, you would reach the final boss of the act and then proceed to the next one. Which is pretty much exactly how the quests work in World of Warcraft. Both back in vanilla and even more so now that they have refined their systems. You come to a new zone, you're starting to get told about the story and what's happening in this zone, and it's a small, compact story, nothing too difficult to understand. And by the time you finish the zone, you will also have finished the story, and it will be ended in you killing a boss, doing a dungeon run, killing some kind of elite, or having some kind of fight, or a little bit of a cutscene. Or if Blizzard are feeling incredibly fancy, then the story will be led on into another zone. If you ever played Diablo 2 on the Battle.net, you should be very familiar with instancing, because practically any game you open of Diablo 2 is instanced. Right? It's instanced for up to 8 players. That's all you can take into your game, and your game exists simultaneously to other people's games. And I'm not calling Diablo 2 an MMO, calm down. I'm just saying that particular way of design is what they then utilized in World of Warcraft for dungeons and raids. And the item system is of course the most obvious similarity to Diablo 2. Diablo 2 was all about loot and all about the different qualities of loot. You would start out with your white gear, and then you'd get your blue gear, and then you'd find some yellow gear, which was great, and they'd be rare items, yeah, and there were unique items. And it's really very similar to how World of Warcraft then worked as well. With you starting out in mostly greens, and then you get some blues in your first dungeons, and by the time you hit max level, you equip yourself in all purples. And then it's just a matter of running more and more content to consistently upgrade your purples to better purples. It is really very similar to how these action RPGs operate. And so I'm going to be so bold as to say, no, World of Warcraft is not an MMORPG, it's actually an MMOARPG. And I'm sure you'll protest and say, oh, but World of Warcraft has all this story that they put on top and that makes it an MMORPG. But does it really? Is the story really that integral to the gameplay? Because it seems to me that the story in World of Warcraft is much more alike to the story in a Diablo game. And seriously, just go over to YouTube and search for World of Warcraft whatever expansion cinematics compilation. And you'll find videos where they cut all of these cinematics together, and if you watch that, you pretty much get the gist of the story for that expansion in like half an hour to 40 minutes. And yeah, that is pretty much exactly how the storytelling also works in Diablo or in StarCraft 2. That's not really that special. It's not something that really suddenly turns this game that at its core, from all of its mechanics, is much more focused on the ARPG side of things into a more story and social interaction focused MMORPG. And yes, I know there's RP servers and all this other stuff, but if you really think about it, all of these other things, the role-playing and the events and the Pokemon and all this other crap is really just building around the framework. All of this is either what people do with what they are given, i.e. the role-playing, something that World of Warcraft certainly is not made for, and all of the other tacked-on systems like the Pokemon. These are not things relevant to the core design of the game. The game would function entirely fine without any of those parts, whereas it would not function if you took out any of the parts that I described. So that is the core of truth to that meme. World of Warcraft really was the first of its kind, and pretty much every game that has come out since World of Warcraft has in some way tried to copy it, because they all saw the incredible success that they had. Before World of Warcraft came out, the average top-level Western MMORPG topped out at about 500,000 subscriptions. That was it. 500,000 subscriptions was considered absurd amounts of success for a Western MMORPG. MMORPGs over here have always been a small market, and they only became big with World of Warcraft. And so while I'm not trying to say that World of Warcraft is the only true MMORPG, the only one capable of being big, what I'm saying is the actual market of people who like MMORPGs, right? The base core line of MMORPGs is actually very small. And there is a much larger portion of people who like the sort of more mainstreamed version of MMORPGs that World of Warcraft has popularized. And in the coming up to 13 years since World of Warcraft has released, we have seen largely games that were heavily affected by this so-called titan of the genre. You have to remember that the development cycle for an MMORPG is much longer than for most regular games, ranging anywhere from 3 years to 8 years, with most of them being made in about 5 years. That means anything that came out after World of Warcraft and up to like 2008 had started development before World of Warcraft was on the scene, and a lot of them made alterations to their game based on that. Star Wars: The Old Republic is probably the best example of this, as it was in development before World of Warcraft released, but because of World of Warcraft's success and because of how World of Warcraft was so insanely different from Star Wars Galaxies and all these other MMORPGs that came before, major alterations were made to the game, and the game was, just like World of Warcraft, turned more toward the action RPG side of things. Just with a much heavier sprinkling of story, and that was really going to be the theme of these last 12 to 13 years. MMORPGs that are basically World of Warcraft but have a twist to them that makes them just not World of Warcraft. And you can kick and you can scream and you can argue, but this is simply a fact. Most of the MMORPGs that have come out since World of Warcraft have heavily aped it, because they have copied those 5 basic principles to the gameplay that I outlined earlier. And especially every single one of these so-called WoW killers. You just have to check. They all have questing systems, they all have instance dungeons, they all have instance raids, they all have instance battlegrounds, and they all have perpetually increases in power in their loot system, and green, blue, and purple. I mean, for fuck's sake, that whole green, blue, purple thing is actually something that World of Warcraft introduced in those specific colors. And since then it's become standard. It has transcended the bloody genre at this point and is being used in all sorts of other games. It has become such a standard. There are some exceptions to this rule, games that are a lot closer to your sort of baseline MMORPG that only take, you know, between 1 and 3 of these core systems from World of Warcraft, but there has not been a single MMORPG since World of Warcraft that has not taken at least 1 or 2 of these systems and made it their own. Now, games such as these that only took 1 or 2 of these things, I would not necessarily call WoW clones, because that's just too vague, right? They just took these systems because, well, they seemed popular at the time. And a good example of this would be Tabula Rasa. Tabula Rasa had instance dungeons and it had questing, but it didn't have the other things. It had a pretty innovative system for items. It didn't really have instanced raids and did a lot more with the open world. And it didn't have instance battlegrounds either. The PvP was very much in the open world. But most other MMOs of the last 13 years have very much conformed to these 5 tenets of MMORPGs. But then between 2010 and 2013, ending with the shutting of Warhammer Online and the move to free-to-play of Star Wars: The Old Republic, which was of course the biggest of the WoW killers, that was really the wake-up call for most of the other studios to say, okay, we're not gonna do another one of these, because they're just not gonna be popular. World of Warcraft, after 7 years, is still reigning supreme. And some of these games that were supposed to kill it have utterly failed at doing so and have barely broken even. There really is no money to be made in the MMORPG genre, because the people who want that genre already have WoW, and WoW does the MMORPG genre in such a crisp and beautiful way. And on top of that, it has the cool Warcraft universe, which is just excellent and just makes the game so much more enjoyable. That, for example, is where games like Rift failed. Rift is basically World of Warcraft at its core. It has taken all 5 of them and has basically gone out of its way to be as close to World of Warcraft as it can be, with 2 factions and all of this sort of stuff. It added a whole bunch of extra things that were common in MMORPGs before WoW, but again, they really weren't that important to the game and were really just filler or, you know, refining the things that World of Warcraft had done. But the problem was that instead of the incredibly cool Warcraft lore, it had the Rift lore, which was alright, but it was kind of generic in a lot of places and just wasn't that fantastically awesome compared to the Warcraft lore. And so people who went to Rift from World of Warcraft rather quickly became bored with what Rift had to offer, because it was exactly the same bloody stuff that they had already done in WoW, except that it didn't come with Thrall and Tyrion Fordring. And instead had a bunch of characters. I can tell you what they look like, but I couldn't tell you their damn names because they are just a little bit more forgettable. And so as all of this happened, developers and especially publishers said, nope, we're not gonna fund any more of this, it's pointless. But a couple of projects were already in the making, hence Wildstar and Elder Scrolls Online. Those games had been in the making at that point for years, so it would have been much worse to just cut them off and never release them. It's better to bring them to an end and then release and, you know, hope for the best. Which is what they did. Worked out for Elder Scrolls Online. Didn't quite work out for Wildstar. And then we entered into the long drought period, where since a couple of years there really hasn't been any big major AAA MMORPG, and there's also no announcements for a AAA MMORPG. And so let's get into my predictions for the future. What do I think is going to happen? Well, I think MMORPGs will continue to live on as World of Warcraft and as Final Fantasy XIV, with all of the other ones that are sort of in between and try to meddle with other genres, stuff like Elder Scrolls Online. If they have a big enough IP, they are going to ride on that, such as Star Wars The Old Republic and Elder Scrolls Online. Especially Star Wars The Old Republic isn't going anywhere, while Star Wars movies are releasing every year. So they're covered for at least another 2 years or so. But all the other smaller ones, well, they are going to wither and die, I'm afraid. I don't think that these games can live on indefinitely, because they just don't offer anything that these bigger, more budgety games don't offer. And I think Rift and Wildstar are the biggest examples of this. They offer pretty much exactly the same thing that you can get in Final Fantasy XIV and in World of Warcraft. But Final Fantasy XIV and World of Warcraft are actually really good. And now that Blizzard have pulled their heads out of their asses, both of these games are now also releasing content at a very steady pace again. And that is just something these smaller games simply can't keep up with. And while they're all free to play, they're becoming more and more obnoxious in their money grubbing and their pay to winning, and it's just so sad. So I think in the next 5 or so years, we're going to see a lot of these WoW clones or MMORPGs shut down. They're simply not going to continue like this. A lot of them are just too small, and they're going to get ever smaller because they just don't have a growing audience. And I think in 5 or 6 years' time, we are going to be left with 5 of these games, namely World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy XIV, Elder Scrolls Online, Guild Wars 2, and Star Wars The Old Republic. Because these 5 games each have a strong IP to build on, they each have good flow of content, and while they are very certainly all MMORPGs, they do things in just different enough of a way to attract a sizable amounts of players each. Beyond that, actual MMORPGs, as they used to be before World of Warcraft, are going to continue at exactly the same pace that they left off. Enter the coming era of crowdfunded MMORPGs. Once these games launch, and I do think that most of them are going to see the light of day, each of them will have a relatively small player base, but I think some of them do have the potential to grow to a sizable player base of a couple of 100,000 up to maybe 500,000 players. But that would already definitely be the upper end, I think. I don't think any of these games are really going to go for 1 million players. Now, if Ashes of Creation turns out to be not a shit game, then I think simply because of the shady things they are willing to do with their referral system, they're going to have enough hype and marketing behind them that they might be able to reach over 1 million players. But the other ones I think are going to have healthy populations for a decently long while, but are never going to crack the 1 million player number. And beyond that, I really think there is a subgenre of MMORPG that we are just starting to see a glimpse of, with really small indie projects such as Gloria Victis and Life is Feudal, and also with projects that are being hinted at, such as New World by the Amazon gaming development team. I really think that if New World and maybe even Gloria Victis or Life is Feudal, when they are finished products, if they can get any amount of attention, then I really think that that could be a rather successful subgenre within the MMORPG genre. And I really think that a lot of people's mentality is going to have to change. You are never going to see another game like World of Warcraft. That's just not going to happen. Even in these other subgenres of MMORPGs, there's never going to be another game that has 10 million subscribers. That's ludicrous. Maybe in Korea or Japan, but certainly not in the West. But we'll just have to wait and see. I'm certainly very excited to see where these two genres of MMORPG are going to go. The one that are sort of more mainline and focusing back on the olden days, such as Pantheon Rise of the Fallen, Crowfall, Camelot Unchained, Shroud of the Avatar, and even Ashes of Referral. And then of course also that subgenre of survival MMORPGs, such as Gloria Victis, Life is Feudal, and New World, which are all looking very fun indeed. And then there's of course also the mixed bag of all sorts of other MMO things that happen, like Albion Online that is about to launch in just over a month. And things like the coming Lost Ark and Lineage Eternal. I really think that that sort of true MMO ARPG kind of game can also still very much make splashes in the gaming world. I think the only people that the future really looks bleak for are those who actually are waiting for the next game that is like World of Warcraft. Alright guys, thank you very much for watching this rather long video. If you've watched this entire video, do let me know in the comments by posting Custard Cream. And I shall know that you are indeed one of the hardiest warriors I have ever encountered. Also do consider liking the video and consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't done so yet. Also head over to twitch.tv/CloakingDonkey where I stream pretty damn regularly. But until then, I've been the CloakingDonkey and I'll see you in another video!